We make our shots. We all do. That's what we do. That's what we do. And we keep doing it.
Matt, thank you so much for joining us in these conversations around Spirit Behind the Lens, and particularly your amazing book, the one that you wrote. Please remind me the title.
Narcissus in Bloom, an alternative history of the selfie.
Thank you. Thank you. It reminded me of internet lies and being mimicked back. And it reminded me of just how human we are, or rather how monkey-like we can be in terms of how we see things and we copy things and what monkey sees and monkey does. And not to reduce us to animals, but we are still prehistoric creatures with amazing technology in our hands, aren't we? And we still are fascinated by what we are. Almost like we sort of inherit these bodies and our spirits are inside these shells, but we still haven't quite figured out what the shell is and what the shell does. And we care about what the shell is about. And I really wanted to enjoy your take on photography, particularly as my take is the spirit behind the lens, i.e. a lot of the consciousness happens behind the camera, not necessarily in front of it. But with the selfie, it's kind of like the cannibalism of the image. I mean, tell us about your book essentially and how that sits in with the spirits behind the lens.
Yeah, I mean, the book's been out almost a year now, and I think I still have some regrets about the subtitle for it, the alternative history of the selfie. If only because the selfie as like a concept, as a sort of form of photography, as this kind of and that word, I guess, being most associated with the purely like vernacular, like the thing you will do on your phone. It's almost a bit of a misnomer, because I think what I liked about it was actually from Kim Kardashian's collection of selfies that she called Selfish. And I loved that title. The book is a different matter in itself, but the title I thought was great because it's not just, it's like her playing on the fact that she's just renowned as a sort of quintessential narcissist, but also this strange tension between who she is at home, who she is in the public eye, that she's not just selfish, but she's sort of half a self. She's a self, sort of. And I kind of wish I'd put the IE of selfie in brackets. I think in writing the book, my background's in photography originally, though I don't do much of it these days. But I always was fascinated by, I guess that spirit behind the lens, and also I guess the spirit that's in front of it too. That how much we kind of openly love photographs that we take, the photographs of people, but they're kind of such strange objects where we are kind of left with more questions than answers. And what is a self? How do we understand ourselves? Just because selfies are everywhere, I guess that's the kind of the underpinning of the book, is that selfies are everywhere, but that doesn't mean we're any more certain about who we are. Actually, it's all a complete mess and we're all just struggling through.
Yeah, absolutely. I was touched by that Kim Kardashian book as well. I believe it was a Rizzoli book. And then I sort of recently came across his Audrey Graham's new book. Audrey Graham, popularly known as Drake, put out a book of poetry. And I really thought that would be the ultimate mashup book, where you have Drake's sort of vacuous poetry meets Kim Kardashian, and the two together will be a summary of the world we live in today. And maybe by the end of this talk, I might read some poetry by Drake, but I believe he's on his way to being cancelled this week because he has now lost the rap beef between him and Kendrick Lamar. But it very much is a summary of where we're at now and how quickly we get churned over, as it were. But I also thought more precisely about how we subtitle images. And I think you sort of raised a really good point where you felt like actually the subtitle required the brackets. And that comes back to my other part of the book, is the way words frame photographs. And how do you find writing about photography?
It's I guess the last book was kind of an attempt to sort of reckon with that. I never really wanted to be a writer. It wasn't my intention at all. And I went to I did an undergraduate degree in photographic art just over a decade ago. And yeah, loved it. I mean, loved it. Was just photography was just sort of like the lifeblood, doing it every single day, everywhere, any excuse. But I guess sort of was a bit sort of contaminated by that sort of more academic process of having to write something. For a long time, I resisted it completely, and I sort of still look back fondly on having to do the whole degree show sort of thing. I didn't want to write an artist statement. I made a mix CD instead, and that's what people could take away, and like you could listen to songs that kind of were my personal soundtrack to making the pictures. I thought that was a way better representation than words could be. And yeah, and I guess it's similar with your work, like the fact I was always way more interested in the relationship between music and photography. Yeah. But had to write something, and I think made a go of it. And actually didn't like a lot of writing about photography that I found about the place. A lot of sort of philosophies of photography. I thought they were kind of a bit wanting, a bit too romantic. And then, yeah, 10 years later, I finally got around to writing a book that felt a bit about like, okay, I'm going to actually give a proper go at this now. I've kind of left my camera behind, sadly, though not entirely. And yeah, it's there's a whole other kind of dynamic there that now I do appreciate a lot more, that writing about photography is so difficult, as if almost like you're that kind of cliche of a picture is worth 1,000 words, but then well, okay, what are those 1,000 words? That's a fun sort of writing prompt maybe, or a challenge, but I still don't want to lose the picture. And I guess I guess what I like now is I do write probably more than I photograph, but then photographs can bring something stranger to writing. Writing isn't explanatory. It brings back some sort of more another kind of way back into the kind of uncertainties and indeterminacies of like lived experience. And photography's sort of strange relationship to that is sort of the magic of it for me. And never want to lose that, especially when writing about it.
Absolutely. I struggled with when it came down to it, I had to write in first person. I couldn't write in that holy third person, that the voice of God. I just couldn't find it in me. And then after that, I tried to find as much as I could that supported that level of thinking. And all I could find was Sun Ra, or at best, Annie Arnaud, and her photographic writing, or writing photographically. And that really made me think more about the challenges of writing around photography, about photography, trying to be sincere with photography, as if it emerged from the same place as music or song or poetry. And that struggle and this conversation is really just to reinforce that struggle's needed, that we have to find a way that gives photography a voice that's I can't really put my finger on it. You know, it's hard. I can only read scripts or lines from a book and feel like that's the voice of photography, but not necessarily. I don't know. I think it's a good challenge to have right now. I think it's worth having it. I think it's worth having this conversation. I think it's worth struggling with it and finding something that you can settle on, even if it's not quite there yet. And I very much had fun with that. So what voice did you use in your book?
I did use the third person, but that was kind of knowingly. My first book, which wasn't about photography at all, but about the work of Mark Fisher. And there was actually a lot of photographs in that book. I was a student of Mark's when he died, and was still kind of had come out of, I was still trying to be a photographer at that point, and was just documenting everything, writing things down, taking photographs, and wanting to write about that experience. And that was in a similar way to you, I guess. I couldn't escape the first person. But when that book came out, people didn't like that. Some people didn't like that. It was like, this is too self-centered, too self-involved, and I think someone did call it narcissistic at one point, which really stuck with me and annoyed me. because it was I didn't know how else to approach a personal experience. I wanted to talk about community and the sort of the politics and the poetry around this kind of quite intense experience, but the third person just felt too presumptuous about other people's relationship to those things. So then when it came to, it was that kind of question of, that this is narcissistic, when really I think the first book was an attempt to problematize myself, to say, well, okay, this is my perspective. It's definitely fallible. It's not perfect, but it's trying to connect with a community, with other people who are sharing this experience. So yeah, that was a book about community in the first person, and it sort of was a personal joke in a way to write a second book that was more about the individual, but then in the third person, and sort of highlight that tension from the other side, those problems, I guess, that you're talking about, right? That there's no single answer. There's definitely no easy answer, but sort of staying with the trouble of how we not just represent things, represent ourselves, represent our experiences, whether through photography or writing or anything else. They're always sort of partial and incomplete. And that's kind of the joy of it, that these things are problems, and then you kind of give your own, maybe you ask a question and then you give it to other people, and there's kind of it's always sort of striving for that reciprocity or conversation anyway. And especially, when you have like an art form that you're working with that feels so individual, that is just you and a pen or you and a camera. And it's like, no, it's never just me. It's all of these other things and forces and people, and trying to give an account of that. Yeah, is a well, it's my favorite problem, I think.
Yeah,
of all the
absolutely.
problems that we have.
I mean, I totally agree, and I find it's interesting that I would take my problem, that particular problem, having shot, developed, processed the film, and now I'm in the communal darkroom in Brixton, and I'm printing with other people in the room, sharing my conversations with them. And in no way does it feel selfish or narcissistic if I'm saying, I did this, I went here. Because what's interesting about that conversation, particularly around the washing table, or particularly around the developer, is that the person in front of you is also processing their own images. And so we're both having the conversation about what we're trying to explore and what we're excited about. And for me, it might have been the way I rendered clouds, or the way the film renders clouds. But I found myself going down another route, particularly because of the darkroom, which was a sort of Mark Fisher style influence of hauntology and the haunting, and particularly when you're using film that's out of date, or film or paper that's from manufacturers that no longer exist, using ancient materials or ancient cameras, and how in themselves they carry a certain look and feel from another time. And somehow this haunting, this thing, I couldn't quite sort of, I could see what the spirit of Fisher's words were doing to me, and how it was making me reevaluate how I made prints and how I photographed the landscape. But at the same time, I couldn't complete on the theory meeting the practice, although the body of work feels like it's just loaded with Mark Fisher vibes, all of which I cannot even describe or put into words. And that's like a weird thing to happen. And I'm not sure whether that happened to you as well, whether somehow his prophecies or his words just infect you. I don't know if you found that.
Yeah, I think there's something about photography specifically, and maybe how we think about it in a general way, where, I don't know, if I'm thinking about composition, it's all kind of, it can feel sort of like you're playing with these sort of more ephemeral things. It's about light, or it's about, your sort of position and the angling of things in a frame. But I kind of noticed more and more over time. I mean, even now, what I love, I mean, I think before we started recording, you were mentioning this Data Moriyama, who's probably one of my favorite photographers, but because he does capture that, he doesn't seem to photograph things, he kind of photographs textures. And there's this kind of like jumping of a gap where you're not there with him, You're maybe looking at these photographs on very nice, pristine printed pages in a nice photo book, or behind glass on a wall or something like that. But you kind of get the feeling of that, you get the texture of being there. And all of my favorite photography kind of engaged with that, I think, where it's not really about space or time or light, or it's when you can sort of you can feel something.
Yeah.
And in my head, that's kind of what hauntology, in a lot of Mark's discussions of hauntology and other people's, kind of really gets at. I mean, especially with the music, when he's talking about hauntological music, it's always this, you can hear vinyl crackle, or you can kind of hear warping of materials in this thing that you might not be able to see or actually feel the object itself, but it kind of carries this objecthood through the air. And my favorite photography does that too. It's so peculiar. And I think maybe it sounds sort of strange to say if someone is watching this conversation and isn't a photographer, but when you're talking about being in the dark room, when you're talking about handling chemicals and materials, it is so like textural. It's so literally hands-on, more so than just like your eye and your mind, but your hands are so involved in shaping these things, and that's always missed, I think. Or even like the feeling of walking through spaces. I don't know. It's those things that are kind of so personal in experience, but are missed when we kind of come to put things on walls or in books. It's when there's like a hint of that left. That's hauntological to me, anyway.
Absolutely.
That lingering presence of yourself. Yeah, the spirit behind the lens. Which is a great title, I think, because it definitely kind of gets that sort of hauntedness of that process, if and all these other things that kind of go along with it.
Absolutely, and it is very much about that process. And I'm coming back to Don McCullin as well, and in his later years as he became a landscape photographer, and you felt like his work of the landscape, as innocent as it looks, is just haunted by years of seeing death and everything else, and it's just imbued in the work. And even in his portraits, I believe, what I can see in my mind's eyes, portraits of religious leaders, and how dark and how overprinted it was. Very much a darkened process, but you can see there are no highlights in it. There is no balance in the work. It's dark. And I kind of saw myself really going deeper and deeper down this darkness, as it were, to try and, because the darker you make the print, the more you can see the print itself, the material quality of the print. And somehow it made me realize that the medium is the message, and that the message is really this piece of paper. It all begins and ends in an image that will be mediated in 1,000 years' time by God knows what. I don't know what type of entity or life force will be able to see the images that we've created, given that much of our material is designed to last a millennia. The hope is that somehow our view on the past, our views, our frames, our shots will somehow determine how people see how we live today, as if we need to say something about that. I think there's certain complexities that we're experiencing, that we're struggling with, and sometimes at best, the best thing we can do is take a picture, which leads me to this idea that, when I was growing up, there was this idea of flight and fight, that was human responses, and now we have a new nuance to it. It's flight, fight, or freeze, apparently. And I noticed that when people freeze, they pull out their phones to take pictures, as if to validate what they're going through. Like, I don't understand what's happening here, but if I take a picture of it, someone could tell me what's going on. And this leads me back to your book, sort of the selfie in brackets, the using it as self-analysis, as a way of, what am I? Who am I? Am I actually still here? Snap.
Yeah, that kind of... there's always a tension there that that always fascinated me, because I don't think it's necessarily universal. Like when, I think of it when people are at gigs, and there's we've kind of gradually over years we've kind of the idea of holding a phone up at a gig. When you're there, you can just watch it. You don't need to mediate it for yourself. Like that's, just put your phones away, don't bother with it. But at the same time, I mean, for me, that's always kind of been my favorite time to take photographs in a way. Like when there's a difference, I think, between that moment of freeze where you hold something up and it's kind of like you put a barrier between yourself and what's happening.
Exactly.
But then the other way where that kind of you can hold this, or even not, you know, you can carry this thing around, shoot from the hip, and feel like you're even more kind of immersed in the flow of something that's happening around you. It can be a fine line, I think, at times, but there's a tension there between freezing and it's an anxiety, right? I guess like you want to kind of I love that drive to try and capture something as it's happening, and maybe there's a sort of thing in there of like, I want to capture this, I want to remember it in a way that's not just in my own head. And then at the same time, like, that's a wonderful impulse, and at the same time it's not always a necessary one. But then I guess that's partly what comes from honing that sort of photographer's mind, maybe.
Exactly. I'm thinking this is a photographer's impulse. How many times you're particularly when I'm in the English countryside, I'm in a car, I see this amazing scene, I get anxiety because I haven't captured it. I'm in a car. I can't say stop the car. The sun's dipping behind that tree. There's a lone tree in the landscape. I need to have it. It's an anxiety that you just have. And then I think as you get older, you learn to just go, okay, and just keep it moving. It's okay. You've let it go. You don't have to run back and get your camera anymore. I feel like you've got past that stage where you've gone past the anxiety and the need to record every moment of your life, to then actually just being able to sort of contemplate, pause, write about those moments rather. And I think, and then this is bringing me back to the idea of that maybe we haven't lost that anxiety. We've just converted that energy towards writing photographically rather than actually going out your way to take the picture. Because the other side of it is we go out our way, we take the picture, we develop the picture, we look at it, and it's not as exciting as we thought it'd be. It's somehow what we saw was somehow mediated by our own emotions, not by what's actually there. And then sometimes you do actually get the thing that you felt you saw, and sometimes you don't realize you have it. You have to look back on your work, giving yourself 10 years, giving yourself some distance from what's happening in the frame to actually consciously realize what you may or may not have captured. I feel like it is all an anxiety, but it feels like a photographer's anxiety. Even if we're no longer photographers, we still have this anxiety. It's a beautiful thing.
How do you feel about that? How do you feel about that now in the process of putting out this book, where I guess if you feel that sort of maturity in yourself, but then, I mean, the book is beautiful and your body of work is, I mean, for an outsider, it's insane. The sort of to just sort of think, oh, you were kind of, it's like that sort of Forrest Gump vibe of like, oh, you were there at all these parts of history. And it's wonderful to have, like, not to give you a crisis over that, like, the existentially, but you get that. How do you feel about that looking back, where you could say, yeah, maybe I didn't have to capture that moment, but you did, and I think I'm definitely glad that you did.
I think the feeling, the anxiety was very real, and the desire to capture was very real, and I think that forced the image to work. I think there was a lot going on in my head in terms of the type of camera I had, the type of lens I had, and how I saw myself with those two things combined. All those things combined, and how I had to make that work in the situation. So I didn't have a flash, I didn't have a lot of gear, I had a very wide angle lens, and I had to get very close to my subjects to get anything out of them. So that was very much a sort of combative sort of process, but I think I just embodied the values of hip-hop, where I felt like I would have been an MC or a DJ, but more likely a DJ. And my job was to support the MC / the DJ in terms of getting their energy out and getting it, mediating it through this camera, and to keep doing that. And yes, I do have this weird things where fantastic things happen, and thankfully I had a camera there to capture the receipts and prove the point. But there are also times where I did not have a camera, and I was in those situations, and it felt really, And I still won't forget it. It was Plastic People, Friday night, probably around midnight. Skepta's on the mic. The whole squad's on the mic over there. Dizzy Rascals dancing with this beautiful Japanese girl. And in the distance, some twats from Hoxton have walked in, not knowing what they've walked into because it's Plastic People and it's the grime night. And they stepped on someone's trainers, and you can hear this clap as they get slapped in the face. And all these things are happening. And I don't have a camera there, and I'm like, oh god.
Right. Yeah.
And that's
Well, maybe
and
that's part of it too, right?
yeah.
Is it that like there's that desire to, especially, and I guess I kind of want to ask you more about music photography today as well, because it was always a bugbear for me going back years. But there's maybe this difference between capturing a spectacle that's kind of orchestrated before you, and then just capturing a culture.
Yeah.
And I sometimes fear that, I broke so many cameras and lost so many lenses going to gigs as a teenager, and I think would always be sort of looked down on as like, just live in it, stop doing what you're doing. It's like, no, but like something's happening here. I'm not like at a Taylor Swift concert, like I'm in a dingy bar, there's a band playing that no one knows about, and there's a vibe here, and I want to just shove my camera about and capture something of that feeling. But that sort of became harder and harder to do. And I mean, I felt like I wanted to be a music photographer, but it felt like the culture of that had kind of waned to the point that it became a very hard thing to do, at least sort of starting about a decade, 15 years ago, where it all became a bit more like sort of portraiture shoots for magazines that are kind of a bit more clinical. You're not kind of immersed in a place. It's all a bit more like, I don't know, a shoot for any other kind of magazine. Anyway, point being, do you feel like that the negative feelings towards just capturing spectacle has affected today? That drive to want to capture culture, has one kind of outweighed the other?
I think it has. But also, have we seen any new culture since dubstep, really? And I think the internet sort of robs us of this capacity for the culture to manifest itself after midnight, outside of the gaze of publicity, and very much allowing the thing to sort of fester and grow. And so even though I was at Plastic People, and even though this amazing scene was happening in front of my eyes, there wasn't a single camera there to capture it. And no one pulled out their phones to record it, because it was just that tipping point. And it was something magical. And I think allowing things to grow in the dark quietly, and then sort of to come in from the inside, capture and just keep it moving, is still a necessary thing. Whereas it isn't overproduced, it isn't arranged, there are no stylists, there are no PR people, there are no record company people. It's just, everyone's just having fun. It's all happening. I only have one roll of film. I only shoot that once, and once it's done, my camera gets put away, and I end up start dancing again. So I'm very much in it, but and certainly drunk, high, and taking everything else that everyone else is doing, but at the same time relying on my 90s autofocus with a built-in flash camera to do a lot of the work for me, because I literally can't see. I can only feel. Some of the images of Goldie at his best in the club, I couldn't see him. I could just hear him screaming. I turn around, I photograph what I can hear, and thankfully the camera and the flash and everything comes together beautifully to give me the scene that I could feel. That says a lot about the club and how loud it is, and how unavoidable that energy is. It's just so wild, and it still happens. It still happens to this day. I think a few years ago at the Ned, which is a hotel in the middle of the city, in the basement, and the grime kids were there, and they ruined the place. They were smoking, drinking, ruined the place. And I had a point and shoot camera, which allowed me just to be in the moment without necessarily being the photographer of the moment. And most people complimented me that day on what I was wearing because I happened to have a outfit made from IKEA bags. And so I became an odd spectacle within that as well, because I was sweating my bollocks off. You can't really walk around in an IKEA bag. But it's sort of because, but yeah, it became something else. But I feel that since dubstep, and particularly dubstep, I haven't seen anything emerge from South London, at least. Just we haven't turned anything over. It seems that everyone puts their energy in the internet, and the internet mediates the narrative. And with that, we're in this Zardos moment where everyone's like the Wizard of Oz, and they're hidden behind these manufactured scenes that they sort of perpetuate and put out there in their selfies, as it were. And as such, I feel like the cult. I don't know where I'm going to find my next strain of culture or where I'm going to immerse myself. That said, there are pubs in South London now that I've been going to, the sort of the last remnants of like Jamaican pubs in London. And there are Thursday night events where the sound systems get pulled out, where the reggae music comes on. And I, even though I'm 50, I'm the youngest person in the room. And it's going off in there. It's like the energy's right, but everyone's in there sort of between their 60s and 80s, and the music's that bit more slower, that bit more warmed up, but the old boys are in the back still bunning it down. There is this kind of working class, now I'm starting to see it as a class thing, this working class looseness, no pretense. And also I've noticed with these guys, of course they don't have phones. Of course they don't pull their phones out to do selfies. They're beyond that generation. It's not what they do when they're getting drunk and smoking spliffs. They don't take pictures. And so I found myself still gravitating towards that energy and still finding it and seeing that it is there, but it's even more underground, or rather it's older. I sort of feel the same thing when I go to Horse Meat Disco on the Sundays and Vauxhall. No, and I don't know, it's because it's a gay pub. It's traditionally sort of undercover, but it kicks off in there, and it's a beautiful vibe, and you can definitely pull out a camera and get some really great moments of human just ecstasy just being pulled out of people. But no one's taking pictures in there. Everyone's keeping it very quiet on the DL, and I'm in that experience wanting to photograph it, and I probably will at some point because I think it's such a magical experience, Horse Meat Disco. But at the same time, you just realize it's only because it's a much older crowd, and it's very weird to see that, to see sort of, and obviously it's disco, it's old music, but when you listen to the disco that's been played, it's not old disco, it's new disco. It's disco that's been, they've found the tapes, they've pulled them up, they've remastered them, they've re-edited them, they've sorted out the click track in there, they've done things to it to make the disco even more disco. That's just fascinating for me, that I have found new pockets of culture, but it happens to be by old people in pubs, particularly in London, whether it's a gay pub or a Jamaican pub. It's marginalized pubs that can have lock-ins on a Thursday night and everyone, and treat it like it's an underground shebeens. That fascinates me. Even the Friday night at the Tabernacle, which again is a community centre in Notting Hill, but when they pull out their Valve sound system and Sir Coxsone starts playing 7 inches, it's a vibe in there, and yes, there are people in wheelchairs just rocking to the beat, but it feels, again, it's more open, isn't it? Different genders, different races, different abilities, and that sense of being, that's just necessary, really necessary. I think the closest I've ever found to that is in the country is probably after midnight on the beach with the fire burning and someone's playing a guitar. That's an interesting time. And I think, we are in this mixed, but I'm not young anymore. So when young people are doing that, that's when new things are formed. But I'm here for that. I think I've fell in love with it when I first experienced it in Jungle, just after the summer of '88, when all the buildings, all the schools, all the police stations, all these things were shutting down, and people could set up their own sound systems and have their own thing. And, you know, with all respect to the crusties of the early 90s, who are probably like lords and ladies now, but they had a lot of money and they could squat their heart out. And it seemed like they could get away with squatting where we couldn't. The black folk of our community couldn't squat. It just didn't seem like a thing that we could do, whereas they could. But once they brought the sound systems and we brought the music and this thing started to happen, it was quite a beautiful thing. It was a really beautiful thing.
Yeah.
And I think those kind of, so when two oceans meet and you're in the middle of that, you can't help but feel this thing, and you can't help but want to capture this thing. And certainly it's those collisions that I've always enjoyed, particularly in music, and to position myself in those places where it's happening and you want to be there every week, because it is like a drug. It's like something that you want to experience every week in, week out. And I miss that profusely. But as I said, it's still there. Horse meat disco on a Sundays, a pub in Nunhead on a Thursdays. But again, the rate at which I'd be going to the Flower of Kent in Lewisham as a Thursday night pub, and already it's been converted into flats. You know, it's the rate at which we're losing these spaces for culture to foster and particularly music culture to grow is sad, really sad. And I don't know what we can do about it. I'm sure we'll figure out what we will do about it. My conversations with a lot of the engineers now who are building the sound systems are literally using Tesla battery technology to make sure that we can have sound systems that can be run off grid, so you can just rock up into your local forest and just crank it up to 11 and allow yourself to be free and dance under the stars. And if we're lucky, I should have set something up a few days ago, we would have seen this aurora borealis over our heads while we're raving, because that gives us a sense of existence more than anything else in this world. And I think that's the thing, and I'm starting to really appreciate how it's to do with class as well. It's like it's a working class thing, but it has to fuse with other things. It has to be two groups of working class people fusing together. It has to be, or the way it was in the 90s on the King's Road, where one side of the King's Road is working class, one side of the King's Road is upper class. Somewhere in the middle, something magical happens. And it's not just mediated by football, it's actually mediated by music as well. Because particularly on the King's Road, the Chelsea football end of it was a bit nasty and was a bit gnarly. And footballers and football terraces didn't improve until ecstasy came along. But no one gives ecstasy its due rights. The reason why there was less violence on the terraces is because of ecstasy. And particularly the summer of '88, wow. We don't not enough said about the great things that ecstasy brought to our society. And I feel sorry for Leah Beths and the parents of Leah Beths. She was definitely a human sacrifice. But do you remember that week when she passed away and all the dealers changed the name of that particular ecstasy from Mitsubishi to Leah Beths because everyone wanted that particular pill?
Shit. When was that again?
I think it must have been 92, 91. And that was the scary thing. I think also with Leah Beths, again, it's one of those things about drug education. I don't necessarily believe she died of a drug overdose. I believe she drowned. I believe it was one of those classic ones.
That's what I remember hearing about.
Yeah, it's a classic
one. So years later, I think.
Yeah, she's having a bad trip and everyone insists keep drinking water. And 22 pints later, yeah, exactly. Yeah. But we also must remember We for We. I'm going to bring this one up. I'll never forget this. We for We. Some radio station in America thought it'd be very clever for your Nintendo Wii to hold your Wii for 24 hours. We for We. And whoever could hold their Wii the longest will get a free Wii. Unfortunately, she also drowned. Yeah. Yeah. So let's just leave that there. A slight digression. A slight losing it. But I just wanted to sort of balance out the fact that, you know what, we don't say it enough. After midnight, when humans gather with all rules aside and possibly no alcohol, just other things instead, magic does happen. And if that can repeat again and again, week after week, you'll see an evolution. And in terms of the melodies that we use or the sonics that we employ to take us to these other places that make us feel even more human, this is our evolution. this, as I said, now the sound systems are trying to become more mobile, more off grid, more hidden. We want our magic to happen outside of the gaze of the internet, and no Wi-Fi required. You know, and I feel that potentially will be that will allow the birth of new cultures. But again, we just have to write that into our histories, write that into our everydays, and see what we can do in terms of that. And I feel that more and more when I do traipse around the country, because it is this thing of this weird sort of oxymoron of the countryside being quite conservative, but at the same time you're quite remote, you're away from other humans, you can gather without the gaze of others. And as long as you can afford that country mansion and pay off your neighbors, then you will be raving through the night, and the magic that comes with it.
I think that's the difference too, right? That just being visible for the internet, but then also being visible for each other. And I feel like it's always those things of like, I mean, I guess getting back to that, I mean, that it's interesting to hear you particularly give the example of like dubstep. It's like the last time of like sort of feeling that, because I think that's to age myself. That's when I first left home. I moved to South Wales and caught the back end of sort of that dubstep moment in Bristol and around that part, like in the southwest. I guess in the late noughties, early 2010s.
Yeah.
But then, even then, like as someone that was kind of new to that, as like a 18-year-old, you could tell it was the end of something, and it was like it felt a few years later like the last gasp of like that you didn't feel that anymore or again, and I don't think I have since either. But yeah, it feels like that. I wonder if that's part of it. That is that only kind of doing things for the internet, for the gram. That kind of kills something of that, of the literal underground of it, where you can kind of not even to fetishize that, but to sort of see that underground as like just a thing, a place where things percolate, kind of without too much sunlight. And you need that kind of moment for something to actually develop. And I think that's kind of, even with the photography stuff though too, I feel like and maybe that's I don't know, maybe it's romanticizing the capital P photographer role, but like not using your phone for that stuff, but like still taking out a film camera, like not even in a fetishistic way, but kind of having that, even that sort of delay of process of like, I can take some of these photographs in this moment and still be immersed in it. And then, maybe a week later, I can get that stuff developed. And there's a certain distance there that then also allows those things to percolate more. And maybe there's something to be said for photography being a bit too instant these days, where you don't get that to really document and further like help feed a culture. But then writing, do you feel that way about when it comes to writing about these things, that you kind of have that also puts in more of a distance and allows for a kind of recording that's not just the sort of wrong kind of visibility?
I mean, it's interesting because I can only write in those spaces once I've sort of reached a certain theta wave level or a certain level of consciousness, does the words come to me. And that can't happen without all the magical ingredients of the music, the people, the temperature in the air, what you had to get to that point, the fact that you're there, and as it raises your spirits, then you start to conjure these words in your head, and that's where my writing is more like a response, or more like automatic writing. It sort of responds to the spaces that we're in and the magic that's happening around you at the time. And particularly when I've sort of, as I'm coming up, as it were, I'm running around with a camera, capturing all this energy. And then as my film runs out, or as I've down to my last 2 frames, I'll put the camera away and allow myself to just be bathe in this energy, and then the words will come. And then in many cases I do start writing there, and then I start writing on the bus home, I start writing on the walk home, or rather, if it's a really heavy night, I'll try and walk home, because I just need to just keep walking. And while I'm walking, I'm building up the narrative, the story, the feeling, the spirit. the idea of the other spirits in the room, because it feels like it sometimes at its best it becomes like a seance, and you can see ghosts, demons, and living creatures all in the same room, you know, and you sort of know, you know, like, you know, I hate to say it, but you know, when you go through Salisbury or certain parts of England, certain ancient spiritual parts of England, you can feel like, oh, it's here. It's definitely here. That thing's here, and there isn't a sound system or group of people to conjure that thing, because you kind of need it all to happen at once. But when you do have that, it's like, yeah, we're conjuring here. We're in that magical moment, and potentially I can tap into that and tap into the consciousness that's been cooked in that space at that time. And I say that because I was reminded of that sort of driving down to Devon, driving, you know, just hitting South Wales, hitting the moors, seeing those fog at night, and you're the only person on that road, and there's a certain feeling you get in that particular area, certainly around those burial mounds and those stones and stuff, and you're like, oh, there were some fucking raves here. You
Yeah.
be lit, you mans, you ancient mans were out here with your drums, fucking having it, howling at the moon, and the energy was so pure. It's there. Oh God, mate, aren't we just here for that? And obviously, we're in a modern age. You know, we can conjure things up electronically, but oof, that feeling. And those are the words. Those are the words we want to share, isn't it? Those pure moments. And I think that is the thing about that. That's why I feel like the photographic writing, or writing photographically, is trying to tap into that spirit without having a lens or a film to mediate it. And I think that's something that we're chasing. I think it's and this is what makes, this is why the conversation, that's why we're having the conversation right now, is because of the fact that you have been through that process. You've picked up the camera, you've been obsessed, you've caught that bug, and at the same time you've continued by digging down into other aspects of your being as it permeates through you, and it comes up the other side as words. And it's a thing. I think it's a thing that we still need to fight for, really, because I think it's a thing that we're fighting for. And I was explaining that these words, writing photographically, to my youngest, and they were like, well, it's just descriptive writing. And I was like, yeah, but how do you do descriptive writing but put yourself and your spirit in it as well, all the spirits in it as well?
Keep that texture.
Yeah, that texture. Again, back to texture, back to the hand feel. And I think it's something worth fighting for. And as I said, I think the conversations that we have, particularly in the dark room, I don't know if you're around on Friday, but if you've got any negs, I'm in the dark room on Friday. If you want to join me, that'd be great. Just so we can stand around a tray and print one image for 4 hours, just and go over it again and again and again until we're over and inundated by this one image, and we're picking through 20 different images of the same thing to see which one says it best, which texture hits us harder. That's an important part of the process, I think.
Yeah, my favorite part, I think, the least visible part too, I guess, in a way. That's what's so fun about it. I think it's for such a visual medium. It's the stuff that just happens in dark rooms. That there's there's a magic there. It's wild.
Yeah, and the conversations that come with that, and I always felt like they're never recorded, they're never said, they're never shared. Particularly as the relationships that we have as photographers with our labs is secretive. You know, we don't talk about our labs. We don't talk about the huge conversations. We don't talk about the anxieties we have, the fear we have, whether or not the shots have come out at all, or whether or not those experiences really translated into actual images. And I remember really doubling down on my sort of ontological thing and going to a club with out-of-date film, really thinking I could bring some of the past into the present. And the ghosts that were in the film permeated stronger than the scene itself. And so it becomes a weird haze of color, light, and noise, which is really underwhelming. But that's not, that's the realization that you overthought it. You put too much theory into your practice to the point where the theory gets in the way of the practice, when in fact you just need to just be in that zone and allow that thing to mediate and come through. The thing about it is, when new cultures emerge and you are the photographer of that new culture, you are in a position to write away or write into it how it's seen. So with jungle particularly, it was really obvious that the media hated working class people dancing and taking drugs. It's something that is just like, there's an absolute hate for it. Somehow, I don't know why. And so I offered my services to promoters to take pictures in their clubs so that they could have an insider tell the story as to what's happening in the clubs. Because what would happen is, if a Sun photojournalist turned up, he would take a picture of someone smoking a spliff, and then the headline would be "Crack Den in Dalston." And that will be it. The police will be in a week later. They'll shut the whole thing down. It's over. Our good times are just vanished, and we're back to square one on the streets again. So the key for me was to try and make this culture look beautiful, look amazing, look edgy. And I went about that by experimenting with different films, different cameras, until I settled on, a Canon camera, a certain type of lens, and cross-processing transparency film to give you really exaggerated hyper colors. So I kind of managed to nail it. And when it came to garage as well, I had a chance to nail it there, because those kids were super clean. They didn't want any of the rough or the dirty that came with jungle. They didn't want any rave aspects of it. They were wearing Versace. They were wearing really nice clothes, and they wanted to look clean. So I'd shoot a medium format, again, using Kodak VC Vivid Color, or maybe Kodak Ultra Color, just to give them just hyper color, hyper cleanness. And that I felt was really important. And with dubstep, I wasn't around to actually capture it in that way. And in that regard, I started writing, because I just was in the record shops. I was at Bad Apple in Croydon. I'd see the kids come in. I'd feel slightly older than them, even though I wasn't that much older, but I was old enough to not be them. And I could see myself just standing back and watching this beautiful thing happen, just to see it get destroyed by America, just to see Skrillex come along and just take this thing, strip out all the dub elements and strip out all these elements and just leave nothing behind, so that it ends up as a joke in a Deadpool movie. I was like, oh, we were better off when no one knew about it than when they did know about it. It makes for a fascinating thing. So I wanted to say all that to say that by the time you came along and you wanted to be a photojournalist, your one last chance would have been the grime dubstep era, to contextualize that as you saw it, as you experienced it, in the hope that that would then leverage your portfolio to then have you capture other things. But that was the last of it. That was the last bit of culture we crafted. And I'm not sure what we're going to do next. I'm not sure what a hyphenated thing we're going to come up with next. That said, the regions still have the potential, i.e., you can find yourself in Salford on a Saturday night and it's going off, and you're like, oh, this is special. This is special. I wonder where this is going to go. I wonder if this is going to, become a compound and form into something solid. But I just don't know anymore. I just don't know.
Yeah, it feels all. I mean, I lived in London for about 5 years, just before that left when the pandemic hit. But was kind of, and again, it was sort of similar there. I mean, I think it was maybe like a year or two after Plastic People's Shut. There was kind of this feeling in the air of like, yeah, we've kind of lost a bunch of things recently, and that kind of in the height of that moment where there was a general anxiety around loads of like club closures, but you could feel it. There was definitely, like, I remember going, sort of the pubs you've been describing, going to like the basements of pubs in Southeast London, and feeling that there was still, it was still there, it was still going, it was just way less visible. But then having since left, and I live in Newcastle now, and with a bunch of friends who we kind of all left London at the same time and ended up congregating up here. And there's a sort of further mourning of like, I mean, like, even I guess dubstep was kind of the end of sort of reaching adulthood and sort of feeling like there was a scene. But then even then, like, I grew up in Hull, and I do remember like going to Hull Fair, which in the 90s was all jungle and drum and bass, but like coming off like the waltzes and the roller coasters, and like having those sort of like, that kind of particular brand of like white working class, most likely a traveler, like MC, like that kind of like what is it? I can't even remember what they call it now. But there was that you could feel that there was that energy leaking out of sort of the urban centers into the countryside. If not explicitly, like definitely not old enough to go to raves, but yeah, something like Hull Fair, huge traveling circus sort of vibe. It was there. Yeah, later on, you know, living outside of Bristol, but it's there in South Wales, it's there in the Southwest. Don't feel that anymore, and it sort of can and a lot of my friends up here, we get such sort of fear of missing out from like being quite far from London, hearing friends that go to horse meat disco, other nights like that, but it doesn't, you can't feel it here in these kind of more sort of slightly removed. There's been like a total sort of deflation of that kind of rave consciousness. You still get nights, but you get like it's all house and techno that's kind of trying to ape this version of what Berlin was like 10 years ago. Or we did have horse meat disco. I think they kind of came up here and did a night at a club in Newcastle, but the crowd was awful. And it was just the vibes just I haven't had that experience whilst living here. Yeah, it's been years, not since the pandemic. And it's amazing to see that there's so much that's still kind of percolating in London and elsewhere. But
yeah,
my biggest fear is that it's kind of not reaching the peripheries. Like it's kind of it's not having that sort of total takeover of like our sort of cultural imagination as it sort of felt like it did before.
It felt like it could before. I mean, my only hope, as I said, is the idea of a community sound system. Is like somehow the local community centre, the last remaining shekels it has, decides to build a sound system for the community on a Friday night to just have, you know, discounted drinks, nice food, and the community plays music. And there comes and I really don't mind if it's blues or rockabilly, or as long as it's on vinyl and as long as it's by some obsessive individual who's just dug deep as they can go just to pull out this culture and frame it. Then I'm here for that. And I feel I feel like it's in pockets, it's in parts. Sometimes I have to go to certain parts of the world, in England particularly, and follow my nose, because if I can smell the food's being cooked, then I feel the culture's going to come with that, you know. If the barbecue's good, it's going to be good. I may end up at a Brazilian barbecue where they're playing some really emotional music, but I'm here for that too. And it's very small and it's very micro. It's never big, it's never amazing, because once it gets too big, it doesn't feel right, does it? Horse meat disco in a pub in South London is amazing. Horse meat disco on a Friday night in Newcastle almost feels homophobic, and that's just weird.
Yeah, it did. Yeah, it was. Yeah,
how is this?
Yeah,
how did this happen? You know, like so, and it's like, how do we manage that? You know, like yes, Glastonbury is amazing and is a great thing, but look at it now. It's not for me. It's not for you. It's for the upper classes now, you know. And it's funny, I recently just got into rugby, and I'm like, actually rugby is still a working class thing, except when the Seven Nations Cup is on, where we have to just leave and allow the rich people to pretend it's theirs and they can run around in their brown shoes and have a great time, and then we can go back to watching rugby union. And it's just, and again, I don't mean to make it a thing about class war, but I feel that somehow we have to protect aspects of our culture from just being sort of diluted and turned into Tesco's. And I say this because I experienced a Saturday night in Birmingham once. I think it's on Broad Street, where they kettle the entire population of Birmingham into one street, where all the pubs have discounted drinks and bad music. And it just becomes a horrible, horrible place for people to get drunk, wasted, get into a cab, unlicensed cab drivers, not a good look, fights, just women and their body parts everywhere, men and their body parts everywhere. And just to see how the police in collusion with the breweries can create an absolute human mess, as opposed to, you know, spaces, sound systems, maybe no alcohol. the difference between the two experiences, one being legal, one being illegal, but the illegal one being the healthier choice than the legal one, which essentially can hospitalize you in no time at all. And yes, we did mention Leah Beths, and yes, it can go the wrong way, but you know what? That's what. Shall we just say it? Why we still have drug laws? We still have this thing, and we still, and we try and tell ourselves that we're something that we're. It's all very odd, and I want to bring it back down to the selfie again. I want to bring it back to your book, and the history of us recording ourselves. And I want to ask you something about the earliest evidences of the selfie that you discovered. And if you can remind me why that person took those pictures, why that person felt they had to record their existence.
Yeah. So in the book, I start with painting. And it's kind of the first selfies kind of emerge alongside the first sort of initial around the Renaissance, just after, when we start thinking about the concept of the individual. And so you get people like Albrecht Dürer, who kind of paint themselves in not in a self-aggrandizing way, though it's kind of often interpreted that way. I think John Berger's got a really nice bit about this, where there's a really famous painting of Dürer where he looks like Jesus Christ, but rather than thinking of himself as Christ-like, it's kind of aspirational. He's striving to be a better person, and a better painter and all this other thing. And painting self-portraits kind of continue along those lines. They're kind of mostly things that are done by the upper classes, mostly kind of aspirational, sometimes self-aggrandizing. But photography, when photography emerges, it's different. And the first photograph that I look at in the book, I mean, there's debates around who took the first photographic self-portrait, but my favorite one is this guy, Hippolyte Bayard, who was one of these early pioneers in France. He was kind of a rival of what's his name? Louis Daguerre. Yeah. So Daguerre kind of is a bit of an industrialist, he's just a capitalist, really. Has this invention, wants to make it mostly profitable for himself, and so kind of manipulates and diminishes his competition, including Bayard. And he takes this photograph that's titled "Self-Portrait as a Drowned Man," and writes this kind of fake obituary on the back of it that says, this poor wretch has drowned himself because Monsieur Daguerre has just left him on the wastes of history. And it's a beautiful picture. But photography then, again, has always kind of had this relationship with death, with preserving, I guess, the sort of trying to go beyond the finitude of human existence. And the self-portraits kind of always had a weird relationship with that. It's not just about there's that same anxiety again of like wanting to preserve sort of fragments, sort of little slithers of things that we know are always changing, including ourselves. It's not just selfies are kind of never, even self-portraits sort of more formally, and even selfies, I think they're never these sort of purely sort of spectacular things that it's like, this is who I am. And it's like, well, no, this is who I am in a moment, and I will take more selfies because I know where we're changing, we're evolving, and there's an uncertainty and an anxiety that comes from that I think we photograph ourselves as much as we want to photograph the rest of the world around us. We kind of know we're constantly in flux, and so I guess the argument of the book is that it's not this sort of epidemic of narcissism that we're told is sort of going to be it's a sign of this encroaching rot within civilization and culture. Just because it's a part of the same anxieties that we've had for centuries, that we've inherited from painting, but that are so much more pronounced with photography. That way,
I would
we
say,
kind of haunt ourselves.
no, absolutely. And I would say that anxiety is real. I mean, how many funerals have you
Oh
been
yeah.
to and think, my God, what did they really pick that picture of themselves? No, they didn't. No, they didn't. That's your children thinking you're a dickhead, and I'm going to take the last picture I took of you on my phone of you sitting there in Weatherspoons having a pint as being the picture I'm going to put on your funeral memorial. Whereas they themselves, if they had chosen the picture they wanted, they would have been like, no, I would like you to use a picture of me during my Elvis years in full black leathers in 1974, because that was my look. That was the image I wanted of myself. And I say that because I think I'm reminded of you mentioned John Berger, but John Berger's book on portraits. And I think the opening chapter is the Fayum portraits. This idea of portraits that are made so that when you die, that's how you're going to be remembered and seen.
Yeah.
I think that anxiety is so real. Like, what's our legacy? What are we going to be seen as? We want these images to reflect what we think we are, our personalities, who we are, the types of jokes we tell. But the truth of the matter is, when you do die, your children will pick the worst fucking picture of you ever and put that projected on the wall while your body gets burnt and they argue about who's going to have in the house. The anxiety is real, and I don't think it's ever fulfilled. I think that's the worst part of it. Like all these images that we take, do they come? Did you leave instructions for your? No, you didn't. You just took this amazing selfie of yourself, and you just no. The anxiety is real, and I think we've failed. And I think the only people that got it right was the Fayum portraits. I think they absolutely nailed it. Yeah, it's a transaction. You pay someone to do a photorealistic headshot of me looking at my best with my finest haircut and my outfit. And I thought that was really interesting, that. And obviously, the reference that you made, which was like almost like the memento mori, literally, of my moment of death. I've died. This industrialist has stuck a knife in my back. And here I am looking beautiful in this beautifully composed image. That's essentially a joke, you know. It's essentially ironic. That's essentially loaded with pathos and poetry. And again, it's that reminder of how the photograph is loaded with words, because the photographer chose to make a loaded image, and particularly against the capitalists who, as we've started to realize, you know, capitalist fascist people don't have a sense of humor. They don't get it. So this is how they get it. This is how we as humans down the line could recognize that this person thought, felt, and recorded themselves in a context that we fully understand today. And that said, I feel like it's an important part of, maybe we do need to work out which image is going to represent us during our dying days. Because
you said that, just that you reminded me, because it's that the death is particularly sort of becomes into the book, and I guess for a large section of it towards the end, it's talking about how during the AIDS epidemic, and how like photographers like Hervé Guibert, who was so particularly about also writing photographically about his death, his sort of his body, and but that self-representation being so important. And I guess a less sort of macabre example though is, I guess, the one that you gave earlier of, like, you know, being in the club. Is it gonna, who's gonna photograph this scene? Is it going to be you? Is it going to be a Sun photojournalist? And it's that kind of that example of like self-representation, you know, that I'm going to photograph my own culture without someone else, you know, using it for their own kind of moral panic ends. That's so important, and we do it all the time. And I guess it's, you know, that's kind of an even bigger example of, like, you know, if it's not your kids, they're going to choose the worst photo of you. Someone from the Sun will, for you know, the same way.
Exactly.
It's really important of how, you know, how we choose to represent ourselves. And it's not a, but I guess that's, you know, the class politics is important there, politics of power in general. I think that's still there in the selfie. You just kind of have to dig a little bit beneath the spectacle to find it, but I think that's why it's so important to still consider it.
Absolutely. Just and yeah, to anyone who has made it all the way to the end of the podcast, do tell your children exactly what pictures you want to represent you with. Oh, your hair's on fire.
Oh shit.
Beautiful scene.
Oh wow, I haven't done that before.
Oh,
That's a great.
that's a beautiful scene. Oh my God, like, I suddenly got anxiety that I never felt.
That's all right. Shit, that was wild. I'm getting a haircut next week. It's fine.
Okay, fair.
Shit. Wow.
It's a beautiful flame. On that note, Adam, can you join us
Can't believe I've just done that.
as we're lit? I've converted to USBs right now. I now electronicize my
Yeah, you're probably for the best. I was getting a craving, and now I should have waited.
I'm not going to start snorting any snuff on camera. It leaves me with a very German-looking mustache. Snorting your tobacco these days. But no, that was great. I mean, I was really cool with the idea of photographic writing, particularly as intensifying, not just describing, but intensifying, flavoring, giving all these additional detective capacities to your writing. Because otherwise, you don't want to make like photography the servant of just writing, because we're surrounded by writing all the fucking time now with social media, and like, you know, people might post an image of a gig instead of a review, and that'll be used to sort of generate commentary online, and it's a hostile environment. Like, I totally get it, Eddie, when you're talking about how there's a struggle to find photography in cultural spaces, or at least spaces where the culture's happening and developing, because a lot of these spaces where you want to keep photographers out, because you have, you know, someone takes a photograph and suddenly the Daily Mail pick it up or the Sun pick it up. It's almost like a kind of a magical battle for the soul of photography, whether it's just, you know, whether it's actually going to be this, you go into the dark room, you go into the wizard's cave, and you sort of alchemically conjure up this image of the present, which presents, you know, basically a new kind of future that we could, you know, participate in and feel, you know, a sense of being or joy within. Or you've got the model, which is the sort of social media journalism model, which is basically cursing. It is, you know, you have done, and it's basically a curse, and it sticks around for the scene, and it marks you out for destruction by the powers that be. And it's not just magical; it's also, you know, material, because what fucking spaces do we own? Like, even if I was thinking about sort of my time, sort of the metal scene, and thinking about when promoters book like fucking dodgy fucking Nazi bands, and like, okay, what's our recourse? We have to basically Antifa the fuckers until they just get them out of the bill. But because we don't own the venues, we're just applying to people's like consciences. We don't have a sort of community ownership to which we can sort of challenge these things in advance. And I think that's the thing. People just don't own, like, if the working class places that own like their own pubs, like working men's clubs, community centres, even like churches, church halls, that's the kind of space that's fading away now. And when there are sort of spaces like that, it's like, are we keeping photography out because, you know, for example, like queer clubs contemporarily, like, do we want people like making fun of us, basically, like making us content? And it does feel like a battle between the spirit behind the lens versus the ghost in the machine, you know.
Exactly. Which one
ago.
dominates? I mean, my thing is, even on the basic levels, like, can we have more bands on bandstands? Can we just like bring bandstands back and like put proper bands on them with proper sound systems, and just why not? Just, it's a bandstand. What else is it going to do? You know, I don't know. They're still there. They're so well built.
Teenagers to smoke.
Oh my God! That's, yes, in the outdoors. Yeah, of course. Yeah, doesn't smoking help you lower your blood pressure? Sorry. Anyway, sorry. Did I mention that it actually smoking might actually be good for you? But I didn't want to necessarily go there. But I felt, yes, and I appreciate that. So Matt, I want to say thank you again for this conversation. Adam, thank you for hosting this conversation. And as you said right at the end, it is about spaces. We've lost sight of something here, haven't we? We've lost sight of those spaces that are ours to foster, engage with, and to feel safe in, essentially. I feel good about that.